The country's largest coal-fired power station to close early, giving a massive boost to green energy. The ASX surges nearly 1.5% as global markets take a breather. And some good news on the inflation front. It's Friday, the 30th of September 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael. No, I didn't mean that. But if you go through those three stories you mentioned, the country's largest coal-fired power station closing, a boost to green energy, ASX surging, good news on inflation. This is like the Good News Friday podcast.
Yes.
I don't like it.
No, if you'd managed to squeeze a story in about aircraft or...
And there's a cracking airline story at the end.
There we go. Now you've got me. You've got me with all the good news and the exciting stories. Can I make a quick mention as well, Sean?
Yes, please.
It's my favourite time of the year. You know how we're always discussing dates and kind of seasonal kind of things. For a large chunk of the country this weekend, starting tomorrow night, daylight saving.
Don't we love it? The only thing, I am enjoying the early morning sunshine at the moment because we get up very early, and to kind of come out of the studio and have the sun up is a bit exciting. We're going to lose that.
Oh, we're going back into the darkness. So if you're sounding quite moody on Monday morning.
That's right, that'll be it.
It's a seasonal thing. All right. You've got a really interesting chat today. This is something completely different with mathematician Professor Terence Tao.
He is literally a maths genius. He was doing university maths at the age of 9. I asked him whether he was kind of a bit uncool at school, and he said, well, I was too young to know what cool was, which was a really good response. Professor Tao, who works out of UCLA in Los Angeles, is an Australian, and he is very passionate about improving maths and the ability of people to do maths in Australia and globally, of course. And he talks about it in terms of all businesses needs quantitative information. So it's a business problem too, not just a STEM problem. A great chat to Professor Tao.
Yeah, he is described as one of, if not the greatest mathematician alive today. I think that's pretty exciting that it's on Fear and Greed.
Yeah, it was great.
All right, that's coming up a little bit later on, but the main story this morning, Sean, AGL Australia will close the country's biggest carbon-emitting power plant 10 years earlier than planned, bowing to shareholder pressure.
And in particular, pressure from AGL's largest shareholder, billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes. The company will close its coal-fired Loy Yang A power station in Victoria by 2035, 10 years earlier than previously planned. Loy Yang currently provides about 30% of Victoria's electricity. Chair Patricia McKenzie said the company had listened to shareholders, government and energy regulatory authorities when making the decision. She said AGL wanted to reshape its energy portfolio into a cleaner and more flexible one, transitioning away from coal. Now, earlier in the year, AGL had planned to demerge the carbon-emitting assets, such as the coal-fired power stations, from the cleaner ones, mostly retail assets, but pressure from Mr. Cannon-Brookes and other shareholders forced the group to abandon those plans. AGL also operates the Liddell Power Station, which is due to close next year, and the Bayswater unit, which is scheduled to shut down by 2033. That is taking a lot of carbon, or at least coal-fired power stations that emit carbon, off the grid in the next 12 or 13 years.
So what then, Sean, is AGL doing about transitioning to cleaner fuels?
Well, the company will spend $20 billion to develop zero-emissions energy by the middle of the next decade. Ms. McKenzie said the company couldn't go any further without causing market turbulence. It's targeting several renewable energy sources, including pumped hydro and hydrogen-fired peaking generators, as well as wind projects. Now, Michael, you might remember this. Earlier in the year, we were talking about when the AGL demerger fell apart, and the reason shareholders didn't like it at the time, including Mike Cannon-Brookes, was that they kind of argued that AGL was putting the problem on someone else. Well, what they announced yesterday means that they are taking on the problem themselves. So good on them.
Yeah, it seems like there is a certain momentum growing now in the push for green energy in Australia.
Yeah, look, it's taken a while, but in recent days, we've had AGL accelerate plans to close down Loy Yang. We've had the Queensland government say it wants to stop coal-fired generation in the state by 2035. It's going to spend $60 billion over 10 years in transmissions and renewables infrastructure. We've also had the federal government launch a national electric vehicle strategy discussion paper, which includes incentives for EV manufacturers. If you throw in the New South Wales government's $32 billion over 8 years for its energy infrastructure roadmap and Victoria's 10-year $19 billion spend on wind farms, there's a lot going on in renewables. It certainly is the hot sector.
Yeah, sure is. All right, what happened in local markets yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 closed up 1.4% to 6,555 points. Most of the day it was actually about 2% higher. It just fell really in the last few minutes of trading. It followed an unusual intervention by the Bank of England to buy bonds to support the economy. That action certainly seemed to calm nerves worldwide. About 85% of the top 200 companies rose yesterday. Woodside Energy led the way, jumping 3.6%, while the big Australian BHP rose 3%. The banks were strong. CSL and Telstra both rose 2%. The retailers were the ones that underperformed, really. Best on the day was Premier Investments. More on that shortly. Otherwise, it was the miners that did best. No surprises there. Lithium Group, Sayona Mining, coal companies, Coronado Global Resources and New Hope, and Gold Explorer De Grey Mining all were among the best performers of the top 200. The worst was financial software group Iris. It blamed challenging market conditions for an earnings downgrade, and its share price got thumped, down 17%.
And what about international markets?
Well, I mentioned the action of the Bank of England. It said it would intervene in the market through temporary purchases of long-dated UK government bonds. The purpose is to restore orderly market conditions, and the Bank of England said it will do it at whatever scale is necessary. Quite drastic action there. But global equity markets did jump as a result. It also boosted oil and gold prices. In fact, commodities generally picked up over the past 24 to 36 hours. One commodity, though, we don't talk about much is orange juice futures. And I do want to mention it. Hurricane Ian hit Florida. I'll tell you more about that shortly. It's expected to wipe out about 90% of the state's orange crop. Now, Florida is the biggest producer of the citrus fruit, in the US at least, and futures prices have jumped 10% in the past fortnight. The US accounts for about 11% of global orange production, but it's just interesting that that weather event can have an effect on you and I who are going to buy orange juice in the supermarket in the next month or so.
All right, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, the High Court in Australia has a majority of female justices on the bench for the first time with the appointment of Jane Jago.
The 57-year-old federal court judge replaces retiring Justice Patrick Keane and is the Albanese government's first appointment since the May election. She's from New South Wales and is the 56th appointment to the High Court since 1903. Of course, the High Court is the highest judicial body in the land, making final decisions across Australian law. Good luck to Justice Jago.
A big day as well yesterday for economists, Sean, with the Australian Bureau of Statistics releasing its first ever monthly measure of inflation. The number was high, but not as high as some economists expected.
Yes, there was a lot of excitement yesterday about this number. Now, the new measure has been in testing for a while, and it shows that consumer prices rose by 6.8% in the year to August, down from 7% a month earlier. But that 7% in the year to July, which was actually, that figure was only released yesterday, was the highest annual inflation reading in 30 years. The fall into August was mostly due to a drop in fuel prices. Where there is inflation is in food and non-alcoholic beverages, with the 12-month inflation rate increasing to 9.3%. Incredible, mostly thanks to higher fruit and veggie prices.
The Bureau also released figures showing job vacancies fell last month.
Yeah, that's right. Vacancies were down 2% over 3 months to August, although they remain at historically high levels and are more than double pre-pandemic levels. Also, Michael, the ABS released data on household wealth. It fell by nearly $500 billion in the June quarter to $14.4 trillion. $500 billion. Now, that's the largest quarterly fall since 1989. Essentially, it reflects falling share markets and property prices, which we do know. Mind you, wealth was still 8% higher than a year ago. Translating that to an average household, wealth fell by about $20,000 to $554,000 per household.
Now, Sean, Premier Investments, which owns retailers including Just Jeans, Smiggle, Peter Alexander, which seems to have a pretty steady stream of deliveries to our house, I've got to say, has announced a 5% jump in profits and a special dividend for shareholders.
That might be your house there, helping out, I think.
I suspect so. We have done this for Premier.
Yeah, well done. It was a strong year to the end of July, and the group said sales in the 7 weeks since then are a massive 47% higher than a year earlier. Mind you, 12 months ago, the world was in lockdown. Premier also holds nearly 23% of the Myer department store. Now, Chair Solomon Lew was asked about acquiring David Jones. DJ's current owner, South African-based Woolworths Holdings, is reviewing the future of the retailer. Mr. Lew just dismissed that one, saying he wasn't interested in Myer and DJ's merging. The news yesterday was enough to send Premier's share price up nearly 15%.
Yeah, big day. Sean, the federal government has done a deal with East Coast LNG exporters, which will ensure that more gas is available for local use.
This is really interesting, and it's in response to the near blackouts and stress on the national electricity grid a couple of months ago, and a competition watchdog report that predicted a 10% shortfall in the East Coast gas market next year. Now, Resources Minister Madeleine King said additional gas will be made available to the market by the big three producers to make up any potential shortfall in supply. Now, those producers are Santos, ConocoPhillips and Shell. In return, the Albanese government won't need to pull the trigger on the Australian domestic gas supply mechanism, which effectively can prevent domestic producers like those three from exporting LNG. Ms. King said the gas supply deal will put downward pressure on prices, though they are certainly unlikely to return to previous lows anytime soon.
The federal government has called on Optus customers to be proactive in protecting themselves from the cyber attack, but it won't be paying up for new passports.
Assistant Treasurer Stephen Jones yesterday said the cyber hack was overwhelmingly Optus's mistake, just as the board of Singtel, which owns Optus, said the CEO, Kelly Bayer Rosmarin, had its full support. Mr. Jones said 40% of Australians were affected directly or indirectly by the breach. Earlier Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said taxpayers shouldn't pick up the bill for Optus's mistake. He also said ways to hold companies more accountable for protecting data is to increase penalties and update privacy law requirements.
How about this one, Sean? The corporate regulator is suing Newey, alleging the board misled investors by pushing false growth targets when marketing its prospectus and for failing to inform investors when it knew targets would be missed.
Newey specialises in transforming huge amounts of data into usable information. Now, that's an in-demand service in 2022. But the company, which listed in late 2020 at around $8, is now trading at around 60 cents a share. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission alleges the board knowingly published misleading or deceptive statements when it said it would hit forecasts in its prospectus. Those comments in February and March of last year suggested the company would grow by around 18 or 19% for the first half of 2021. Instead, it shrunk by about 4%. ASIC is also alleging that the Newey board should have announced a downgrade to the forecast sooner than it did. Newey looks like it's in trouble.
And finally, Sean, a Myanmar court has convicted the country's former leader Aung San Suu Kyi to a further 3 years in prison and, worryingly, sentenced Australian economist Sean Turnell to 3 years in prison.
Dr. Turnell is an academic from Macquarie University who was aiding the former Myanmar government when he was taken into custody early last year. Now, it's not clear whether Dr. Turnell will go back to jail or be deported. I really hope it's the latter.
Yeah, I agree. All right, moving on to overseas news, Sean, and Hurricane Ian, which you mentioned earlier, made landfall at near Category 5 strength along the southwest coast of Florida yesterday, with fears that the storm is responsible for dozens of deaths.
Winds were measured at near 250 kilometres an hour, with some extraordinary pictures of houses ruined, planes turned upside down, and incredible flood surges. Hurricane Ian is among the most powerful storms to hit the US mainland in decades. Millions of Florida residents remain under evacuation orders, with 1.8 million households without power. The storm killed 2 people in Cuba, while 23 Cuban migrants on a boat are missing.
Russia has restricted entry into its border region with Georgia after tens of thousands of men fled to escape being forced into the war with Ukraine.
It's another sign of how poorly the war is going for Moscow. More than 115,000 men have fled to the former Soviet state of Georgia, triggering restrictions on the border. Georgia is one of the few border states that has no visa requirements, and authorities said up to 10,000 Russians have been entering each day. Other nations have been urging people to leave Russia since the mobilisation was announced last week. The UK, US, Bulgaria, Poland and Estonia have all urged their citizens to leave Russia.
And Sean, you teased it earlier on, the reference to an aircraft story that was coming up a bit later on. I was starting to think it wasn't, but here it is. One of the world's longest direct flights, Auckland to New York, has had to recalibrate because of unseasonably strong winds. What does that mean?
Well, after 2 years of planning, the Auckland-New York route commenced operations 2 weeks ago, and the return leg at 17 hours and 35 minutes is the world's fourth longest. But Air New Zealand, which is 51% owned by the New Zealand government, said unusually strong headwinds in North America is playing havoc with calculations. The airline's been forced to offload passengers and luggage to make the distance. In fact, on the flight to New York, the carrier can take a maximum of 260 passengers. On the flight back, it's only 180 passengers. Now, the New Zealand government hopes the route will revitalise tourism to the Shaky Isles. The US was the third largest source of tourists pre-pandemic. And, Michael, there's absolutely no self-interest in that whatsoever.
How long till your trip, Sean?
5 weeks. Just hope they get this fuel issue fixed up.
It's slightly concerning, isn't it, where they have to offload people just to make sure that they actually make it back?
Exactly. I'm on that flight. That's mine.
Good luck. All right, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with mathematician Professor Terence Tao.
Yes, as I mentioned, a very different interview for Fear and Greed, but we talked to Professor Tao all about how he thinks we should change maths and encourage maths in Australia. Really fascinating chat.
Yeah, he's a really, really interesting person. It's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Friday, the 30th of September, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.